Okay, for Polly Weissner, what, if any, forms of new peacemaking have emerged in response to cultural changes in the areas that you study?
So the people, with all this trouble with the introduction of high-powered weapons and increased warfare, the population and the traditional leaders and magistrates in the customary courts are not accepting this. And so finally, for the first time, people are turning against tribal loyalties, and they are turning in to the formal law system and to jail the young men who are causing this trouble. So this is a very big change. They've also decided not to pay compensation for warfare and peacemaking for people killed, which makes it much more expensive. So there are positive movements coming up from the grassroots and from the tribal leaders, very little from the government.
Allison Brooks, what are the prospects for a tribe forming that encompasses all humans?
Oh, that's an easy one.
I think that, should I stand up?
Oh, either way, whatever.
Okay. I think that there are issues of scale that are very hard to deal with. So I think that what seems to work best is to have a sort of nested leadership arrangement where you have small communities that are well run, and then you have that a larger coalescent over authority that regulates the small community. I think it's very hard to imagine a tribe that everybody belongs to. There are just too many differences, too many beliefs, too many ideas about the past, about ancestors, about creations, about all kinds of different views that are always going to divide people to some extent. I don't see those going away. We're just as, in fact, watching the spread of fundamentalist religions in Africa in the last 50 years that I've been working there, I think it's very hard to imagine that all of these different viewpoints can be encompassed in one tribe. But we could all feel that we were productive members of nations. I think that's perhaps the best we can do.
Sebastian, I just wanted to compliment that. One's got to agree that it's difficult to imagine how that would happen. But one way to play with the idea is to think about the evolution of the number of languages, because the number of languages has been declining steadily over historical time. And you can project in the future when there'll be a single word language, which might move us in the direction that the question was asking about. And the answer, I think, is somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 years AD.
So the next question was for you, and is related to that. Does the strengthening of the sense of us necessarily lead to the strengthening of the sense of exclusion of them?
I think the short answer is no. And we heard cases from Polly in particular about how you can build up tremendous group loyalties and not necessarily light the fire of intergroup hostility. So that's great. But on the other hand, I think there are constant temptations in that direction that we constantly need to be fighting against.
Bazarine, how do you show bias towards a liked other? I'm not sure what that means. Maybe you will know.
So that's favoritism, right? I mean,
Yes,
that is what.
yes.
Yeah. So a bias towards a like. So I would say maybe this was maybe you're getting at something I said during the talk where I mentioned that I had an experience, but my experience was just how subtle the similarity of the other might be. And my story was that I was called on the phone by a woman who was a journalist asking me to be interviewed for the article she was writing, and I asked her who she was writing for, and she said the name of the magazine, and I don't don't particularly like this magazine and how it portrays psychology, so I said, I'm finally going to have to tell you guys I'm not going to do this interview. You don't represent this field very well, and I said a lot more. But anyway, she was very nice, and she said, well, I'll tell my editor. And as she was hanging up, she said, oh, Professor Banerjee, I should tell you, I used to be a student at Yale when you were a professor there. What am I supposed to do now? I mean, I should have said, Annie, I'm so glad you and I shared a zip code in Connecticut for 4 years. Bye-bye. But no, out of my mouth, without my permission, came the words, okay, come over, I'll talk to you. And I did the interview, and I've thought about that a lot because that's the bias in favor. And I think that an idea whose time may not have come is for us to think that people like us, we live in such privileged circumstances that we don't have to harm members of outgroups every day. We discriminate by helping members of our own tribe, and that's how we discriminate. Okay? And so now even the act of helping has to be rethought. Not that you shouldn't help, but who are you helping is a very important question to ask now. Yeah.
I'm out of question cards here, but I actually have one question of my own that came to my mind during the conversation. Oh, here's more cards. Oh, there goes my question. Well, maybe I'll proceed with it anyway. Can I ask a question? You guys go. Okay, so I read a book by a researcher named Avi Tushman about the genetic origins of political belief, of conservatism and liberalism. And what he found through, and other researchers, he sort of collected all of this data. What he found through twin studies, identical twins who were raised separately are far more likely to share political opinion, to be conservative or liberal, than fraternal twins who were raised together in the same environment. And he found that around half of the variance in political opinion can be traced to genetic roots, genetic origin. So my question to any of you all is does that, to me, rather heartening and pretty surprising statistic, does that inform any of the conversation that we've had tonight? Would anyone like to address that?
Frank? Yeah. No?
Yeah.
Me?
Well, you were just pointing out that the biology doesn't matter anyway.
So, yeah, I've seen that kind of data. Jonathan Haidt also adduces certain things about, things that go on in the cognitive process of conservatives versus liberals, and that may have some kind of a genetic origin. However, it's only 50% of the variance,
Right.
and if that's true, it inclines things in a certain direction, but it's not that helpful for policy purposes.
Right.
If what you want to do is actually overcome those kinds of biases, you got to work on the 50% of the variance that is not due to, genetics.
Yeah.
So just, I think an important, somewhat technical point about this is that it's important to understand that the percentage of variance that's accounted for in a population by genes or anything else doesn't mean that it's fixed for all time. So it could be that at some future point in time, your genes tell you very little about your politics, right? So for example, you can have a bunch of plants, let's say, in a very low water environment. And in that environment, plants that have certain mutation will be much more likely to grow than the others. But if you have an environment that has plenty of water and plenty of sunshine, then the genetic differences between the plants might not tell you anything about which plant is likely to be taller or shorter. So people sometimes hear those statistics or findings about how much of the variability is accounted for by genes. And it can be interesting and important, but people naturally read that as it's genes and therefore it's fixed forever. But that's not true. It's how much of the variability that we see within a group at this time in this place is accounted for by genetic differences. And that can change over time, and that's important as well.
Thank you.
I would add just how I'd be very interested to know how many people in this audience have a rule that you can't talk about politics at Thanksgiving dinner because of the diversity in your own genetically related family.
Right.
Which was certainly true of mine.
That's a great point.
So, and of many political scientists in faculty that I know who are liberal and whose families are deeply conservative. I think that there's a certain issue with these statistics that
Right.
are
And
that
it's also the case that whatever that genetic predisposition might be, it's not that it directly affects political beliefs. I think that it's manifested through what my colleague Jerry Kagan would call early temperament. So babies vary greatly in their temperament. There are those who run away from their parents and explore the world, and others who stay very close and who are scared. I wouldn't be surprised at all if that kind of exploratory behavior that is not of your own making, it's partly and quite deeply genetic, could lead you to just go off into this new tribe where you go play with a new tribe and those experiences, and you often see those differences in children. So something as simple as a personality orientation that has been called openness to new experience, for example. And it's a marker of humans, and we vary on that dimension, and that could easily translate into something that becomes a political difference as an adult, where you shy away from difference or move towards it.
For Molly, if the internet and social media fuels outrage and conflict, it's hard to read here, more than other media, how did American society polarize to the point of total civil war in the 1840s to 1860s? My point being, is technology really the key factor in polarization? It's a good question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the dynamics that we're seeing in the modern context of social media are in some ways new, but in some ways obviously not new. And it's really difficult to tease apart the differences. I think one question that's on a lot of our minds is, how do specific design features of social media that are choices that were made potentially for very different goals by people at tech companies, how are those design choices affecting our behavior? And is there a way that we can keep what we like about social media and tweak some other things so that the social consequences are potentially more positive?
Thank you. Are you guys prepared for maybe a little bit of philosophy? Okay. Considering terms we use to identify ourselves, whether Italian American, African American, hashtag #MeToo or hashtag Black Lives Matter, how do we speak up for who we are and protect our identities without fracturing our humanity?
It's an excellent question.
Yes.
Well, I would say that your identity, which makes you willing to sacrifice for a group, is your humanity also.
So this is actually an issue that I wrote about in my last book called Identity. I think that one of the problems is that both on the left and the right, the identities that we choose have been getting narrower and narrower. And that has consequences for the overall, social cohesion of the society. And in the modern world, I don't see really any alternative to actually returning to a more integrative identity. And I think it has to be at the nation-state level, because I really don't think that there are political structures that have meaningful control over power at a transnational level yet. That was the aspiration of the European Union, but we're not there yet. And therefore, what you need is an integrative identity based on, some sense of national identity, but it has to be inclusive. It has to be democratic. It has to be non-ethnic, non-racial, not based on religion, but based on a common set of democratic ideas. And that's, something I think that's been missing in a lot of our political rhetoric is, how do you generate narratives that produce that kind of more integrative sense of, who we are.
I might take a quick whack at that one as well. It's a really important question. The most extreme environment I've ever been in socially was combat with U.S. military, with airborne infantry in a small outpost in eastern Afghanistan. And the there was an awful lot of combat. There were a lot of casualties. There was a lot of heroism. Everyone out there was almost killed, at least once, myself included. It was mixed in every conceivable way. I mean, one of the amazing things about the U.S. military, for its many flaws, is that it really is an incredible melting pot. Every religion, every race, every kind of politics, every region of the country, and none of those things were given any thought whatsoever. And the worse the situation was, the less those identities mattered at all. Where racism, for example, was a bit of a problem was in the larger bases that weren't under physical threat. They were not getting attacked. But out at a 20-man position, it was all men, 20-man position, kind of environment we were in, those guys were completely blind to any relative value between who was Italian-American and who was black and whatever. There was only one black guy in the platoon. And so, what I would say, one guy said to me, he said, it's amazing, there's guys out here who straight up hate each other, but we would all die for each other. And there does seem to be something about an extremely challenging, hostile environment that makes people a little bit more blind to the differences between them. And one can argue that maybe this nation right now is suffering from a lack of existential threat. That if we were really under some kind of existential threat, that those divisions that are so poisonous right now to us might actually subside a little bit. Okay, let me see. All right, why do humans prize okay, we're into philosophy, sorry, but there's only 4 minutes left, so we can make it. Why do humans pride themselves of free will, agency, and autonomy if most of history and modernity is full of violence or preparations for violence, even after 2 world wars? So how do we reconcile free will with what seems to be a genetic propensity for violence?
Joshua.
I don't know if I'm qualified. It's funny, it's an interesting question because often the question goes the other way. That is the thought that how can people truly have free will if they don't have the possibility of making either good or bad choices? If everything is just determined from the beginning, either you're determined to be good or you're determined to be bad, where would your free will go? But I take the larger question there is, how can we have this kind of view of ourselves as, in some sense, sailing our own ship and with the possibility of sailing it in the right direction when you look at human history and see all of these horrors? And I think one answer is that human history is horrible in the sense that you can count up the horrors and they're horrible and there are lots of them. But as our colleague Steven Pinker has argued in his book, Better Angels of Our Nature, much to a lot of people's surprise, if you look at the most basic indices of how much violence is there, how much education is there, how much political self-determination is there, things have been generally getting better and better over historical time. In recent years, there have been some breaks, but in the past, there have been some breaks with that. So I actually think a quantitative view of human history is consistent with our being not the worst species that you can imagine and having some self-respect. But that doesn't mean that our big problems aren't very big problems, and we may do ourselves in the end with climate change or with nukes. So it's not like everything's okay. But I don't think that our view of ourselves as individuals or as a species should leave us to give up hope completely, not by any means.
I do also think that this emphasis on individual moral autonomy is a very Western idea. I mean, I can give you an account of how it emerged in the West. I think it kind of has Christian roots, but other cultures do not prize individual autonomy nearly the extent that ours does.
Okay. For Professor Wrangham, have you studied the capacity of Homo sapiens to execute an imagined enemy aggressor rather than one that is actually has actually exhibited overly aggressive behavior? Not sure.
This sounds a little bit like video games.
Yeah, how do you execute an imagined enemy? I'm not sure how you, yeah.
Well, the short answer is no. I have not.
But we have 52 seconds left, so you have to continue on.
Use it as you will.
That's right. You can talk about
But it raises the question of whether or not video games intensify our feelings of hostility towards other groups. And as I understand the data, actually, surprisingly maybe, they have very, very little effect. I don't know if anyone has any more expertise on this area. But,
All right. So, thank you for coming to hear these wonderful, wonderful people share their knowledge. Please give them a huge hand of gratitude. And I'll proceed with the ritual reading of the sponsors and the thank yous. The Leakey Foundation would like to thank our sponsors, Abigail and Bowman Cutter, Chet Kamen and Nancy Schaefer, Ann and Jeff McGee and Calda. Sorry, I hope I got that all right. William and Lisa Worthland, Abigail Bernhardt, Duggan and Aaron Jensen, George and Ann Lace, Diana McSherry and Patrick Poe, Gene Newman, Camilla and George Smith, and with sincere appreciation to Ann and Gordon Getty and the Leakey Foundation's donors and staff, and with special thanks to organizers Chet Kamen and Richard Wrangham. Thank you so much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it.